Welcome to the Datacolor 2013 webinar series. I'm David Tobie. I'm Global Product Technology Manager for the Spyder line of products, and I'm here today with David Saffir, a photographer from Southern California who specializes in portrait and landscape and fine art photography and does a great deal of commercial photography. So today's session is really going to be on portrait photography, and David is going to run the show, being the portrait photographer of the two of us. And I'm going to take questions in the chat window, the Q&A window. So if you would arrange your screen in such a way that you can see the comments that are being made, then you may be able to gain some further insight onto what David is talking about from the Q&As that go through there. Now, we will be giving away a couple of Datacolor products at the end of the event. David Saffir will be doing that, and we will be giving other information at that time. So if you'll stick around, you can take your chances on that. And we hope that you will enjoy this webinar. It's our second webinar on really on holiday photography. So any of you who were here for the one that we presented about Christmas photography or holiday photography in December will recognize certain components of this overlap with that. So that's simply because you know, it's consistency and doing the right thing is still doing the right thing. So let me introduce David Saffir and hand the microphone over to him. Hello, David.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for the nice introduction, David. So today we're going to talk about Valentine's Day photography, the holidays coming up. I've been lucky enough to get some really fun photographs to sprinkle in amongst all the technical information and things like that. I do want to point something out, though, right at the beginning here, and I think this is a key point. Look at these two photographs and the posing, and look at how relaxed these kids are. And I think there's an important point here, is that it's a holiday with a lot of fun in it, and if you can be creative with the poses and the backdrops and the props, you'll get a lot more out of the images that you create, and a lot of them can become lifetime images for you instead of just snapshots. But I particularly like these two, which is why they're on the front page.
Well, David, that's also part of the people skills that go into portrait photography in general. I tend to take photographs of things, and I'm always very appreciative of the special skill set that's involved in making people comfortable and making them open up to a camera and getting them to be good photo subjects. So I appreciate your skills in that area.
Yeah, and you know, one of my favorite things is the two little girls on the upper left. To have two people lean into each other shows, it communicates affection and acceptance and warmth and things like that. And a lot of people take portraits where everybody stands up like matchsticks, and so there's a real art to this in terms of just the posture and having the kids lean towards the camera a little bit and using frontal lighting. All those things work together. So I guess another point I want to make is that it's almost an ensemble of little things and little skills that make for a photograph that's really memorable. And the same thing's going on the right. That little girl on the right-hand side of the photograph was, you know, the photographer said, you know, mug for the camera, and just look at her. She thinks she's Marilyn Monroe or something. So it's just really a couple of really nice photographs that are great examples of the kinds of results that you can get with a little bit of practice.
David, if I could jump in one more time just for a second. As a non-people shooter, one of my criticisms I always make is that children, particularly little girls, particularly ones who are shot frequently by their parents, have this face that they put on, that's their smile for the camera face. That looks nothing like any of these photos. So do you have any input on how to avoid having the mug for the camera and put that horrible face on?
Well, surprise helps. Okay, having a sense of humor helps. Making a game out of, particularly with younger children, making a game out of it helps. Getting out from behind the camera. Frequently with this kind of thing, I will put the camera on a low tripod and use remote release, and I'm right next to the camera and not behind it, and I'm talking to them, or the photographer is talking to them. And as the conversation progresses, you are firing the camera. And so they don't know when the camera's going to go. It's not 1, 2, 3, zowie. It's more with the rhythm of a conversation and the interaction and the relationship that gets you the kinds of expressions that you see here.
Well, those are the techniques I use for shooting photos of dogs. So I guess I know a little more about this than I thought I did.
Well, Andrew Darlow will say the same thing, is that there's a lot of similarity between photographing young children and photographing dogs. He's a very famous pet photographer on the East Coast. So, you know, we're gonna hopefully help you pick up some tips. We're gonna focus on photo services. We're gonna add some personal venues. Another little thing that keep in mind is that the size of the camera. A lot of us own cameras, you know, pocket cameras or point and shoots, and some of us own big honking DSLRs. And the size of the camera matters a lot less than the skill of the photographer. In many cases, if you can get into using the controls on the camera instead of automatic mode, it's going to be the small adjustments and the little tweaks that matter most. And in some cases, you're going to find yourself make a little tweak, take a shot, make a little tweak, and that sort of thing. That kind of exercise or progression requires practice. You have to know where the controls are. You have to be able to move smoothly so that you can capture the moment. And so we will be talking about camera controls, use of lighting and flash, camera supports and editing, those kinds of things. We're going to try and cover the range of activities that's involved in achieving success in this area. Now, before I start on this next one of the photographers that I have worked with over the years, her name is Mitzi Mandel, and she came up with this idea, which is, she's a teacher, to put a chalkboard behind the little ones or the families, because you can write any message that you want behind them, and it looks great. It's cute. It's kid-oriented. She just turns the chalk sideways and writes neatly, and here you go. It's a great picture of a baby with a Valentine's heart. So think about being creative that way with the materials at hand. It doesn't have to be the kind of thing where you spend a ton of money. But you do want to plan ahead, even to the point where you've got a 4x5 card in your pocket or a 3x5 card and you make a little shot list. Think about whether you want to be indoors and outdoors, and that may depend on the area of the country that you're in. You know, today we're in California and it's a beautiful sunny day, but of course it's been raining quite a bit the last 2 weeks. Do you want to be shooting environmental shots, in other words, in the family's home or in a special place that the family likes to go to? Are you going to be more optimistic? Do you want kids only? Do you want groups and couples and individuals? These are all things that are considerations for your shot list. The props and backgrounds can be very important, particularly for a holiday like this. The props aren't expensive. You can make a lot of them yourselves. You can get old candy boxes, which is what I think Logan is holding here. And of course, play with it. Get out from behind the camera, get that remote release going, and just take photographs as the kids are playing. You'd be amazed at the stuff the kids will come up with for you. And the kids and the parents, of course, interacting together can be very, very productive and rewarding. We will talk a little bit about basic image editing and some of the software applications that you can use. But if there's one thing that you take away from this today, it's the word practice. I want you to think about practicing angles and poses and what props you want and what kind of feelings you want to communicate, and also the technology and the way you're going to use it. You've got some time, and you know, getting out and practicing really makes a difference, because if you don't have to think about the gear, you can be thinking about the people in front of you, and that does really help. Now, a quick poll, if you don't mind. I would like to know which camera you plan to use the most for your Valentine's photos. But phone cameras are fine, point and shoot or a pocket camera, an all-in-one with a zoom lens or a DSLR or something else. And we'll just stop for a moment. So mostly DSLRs. Isn't that interesting? That's different than the last time we did this. Very different. Well, good. That gives me something to hang my hat on as we go forward with the presentation. Now, here's a few tips to getting started. This is not one of my cameras, just so you know. One of the things that hit me the other day, I was testing a camera, and I actually had two models. And of course, the different models had different batteries. They weren't interchangeable. And they looked very similar. And I even loaded the camera bag and got halfway out the door and asked myself, do I have the right batteries for this camera? Because if you don't, no pictures. If you have an on-camera flash or a built-in flash on the camera, if you leave it open, in many cases it will continue to draw power from the batteries that are either inside the flash or the camera, so turn it off. Watch your storage areas, cars in particular. Even on a day when it's 50 degrees out, if the car is sitting in the sun for a few hours, your camera is going to suffer. Liquids and dust, we all know that. One little tip that, particularly with small cameras, is that if you're doing a fair amount of shooting and then you put your finger over that flash tube, you're going to feel it. So keep your finger away from the flash and the lens for obvious reasons, and the flash simply is you don't want to singe your fingers. It's a good idea to get a case or a carry bag. It keeps the camera clean, it protects it, that sort of thing, and they don't have to be expensive. You can spend a lot of money if you want to, but there's really no need to. You do want to, I forgot to mention before, spare batteries and memory cards. And by the way, be gentle with memory cards, particularly the little ones, the SD cards, because they do bend easily. If you try to put them in backwards, you can't always tell that it's going in the wrong way, and then it will get stuck. So take your time and be gentle. And do use a card reader to offload photographs from a card. If you're using the plug that's on the camera, just keep in mind that every time you use the plug that's on the camera, it wears out a little bit, and over time it's going to wear out completely, and then the camera goes in for service. Far better to take the card out of the camera, gently put it in a card reader, and move everything over to your computer. It also, if you're working in the field, will help you in terms of not drawing down the amount of juice that's still left in your battery. Now, read the manual. I think it's kind of funny here. This is a screen grab from the Nikon instruction manual. And I thought it was kind of cute that Nikon felt compelled to point to where the lens was. Yeah. But, you know, about 2/3 of DSLR owners tell me that they use the automatic settings. And the thing is that full auto can make mistakes. Full auto can, the meter can be fooled by backlighting, for example, or part of a scene is significantly brighter than the rest. And so it really will pay you to learn the basic controls and some of the manual settings. There are presets on a lot of these cameras. In fact, I'm testing one camera right now that's actually a semi-pro camera, and it has dozens and dozens of presets on them, none of which I'm particularly interested in. I would much prefer to just get it right in the camera and do some of the creative editing afterwards. I don't want to leave it up to what's been pre-programmed in the camera. That's my personal preference. Some people feel that way, some don't. What I'd like to see you think about, please consider understanding how to use the flash controls, the white balance. We're going to talk a little bit about presets and white balance too. The ISO, which is at a fundamental level the sensitivity of the sensor in the camera. We're going to talk about aperture and shutter controls and how you can use those creatively. Exposure compensation, we'll talk about that a little bit. And I'm being a little bit redundant here, aperture, shutter controls, and focus. really all go together. But the idea of all of this is that you keep creative control, that it's not in the hands of an engineer that doesn't know you, doesn't know your situation. They just put together a series of presets that are approximately correct. Well, in my book, approximately correct isn't always consonant with creative control. I would rather get it right in the camera and do the editing as I see fit later on. Now, let's talk a little bit about lighting and flash. You know, a lot of cameras have a flash on the camera, and you can see here, sort of top right, this Nikon has an on-camera flash. Very handy, doesn't use a lot of power, is good in a limited range of circumstances. By the way, one little tip here, you'll notice that in the camera on the right, which has the flash is not an on-camera flash, it's mounted to the hot shoe, that there's a lens shade on the lens. When you're using the on-camera, the built-in flash, you may want to take this lens shade off. And here's the reason, is that sometimes when it's mounted that close to the axis of the camera, that lens shade is going to create a shadow in your image. So practice a little bit, see how well it works, see if it's mounted high enough. And of course, the incorporated flash, the flash that's built into the camera, has a tendency to give you red eye more frequently than a flash or strobe that's mounted above the axis of the camera. They do have a useful but a limited range, and of course on the flip side of that, they tend to be overkill in a close shot. People can look like a deer in the headlights if you're a little bit too close with either type. Do back up a little bit. If the lens shade works with that particular flash, do use it, but be aware that sometimes it's not going to. They're very useful indoors or anywhere where there's backlighting. Flash is adjustable, by the way, and there's controls, and believe it or not, even for a flash that's built into a camera, there will be controls built into the camera. Sometimes they're on the top of the camera. Frequently they're buried in the LCD controls, and you have to grab that instruction manual and figure that out. But you can dial down the flash intensity so it's not overwhelming your subject. You can blend ambient lighting and flash as well, and I'll show you an image in a minute that's a great example of that. And so you can hardly tell that flash was used at all. We already talked about scene modes. And as far as full flash being too much, it's frequently a good idea to try half intensity. And on the back of this particular camera-mounted flash, you have controls here. There's the plus and the minus, and you can dial the flash intensity all the way down to, say, a 16th or a 32nd, all the way up to 100%. And it may interest you to know that when I've been shooting events or portraits or weddings with the strobe mounted on the camera, the flash mounted on the camera, I'm typically never going over 1/2. In fact, frequently I'm at 1/3. Just enough to fill in the shadows under the eyes and give a pleasing look to the face, smooth the hair out, that sort of thing. And basically, in some ways, reduce some of the contrast from overhead lighting in the photograph. So here's a great example on the upper right of using the flash creatively. When the flash is mounted on the camera, frequently these devices have a swivel right here, and you can tilt them up and point them at the ceiling or a nearby wall. And as long as those walls and ceilings are a neutral color, you're in great shape. And look at how smooth and pleasing this image is here. This was in a conference center at a family event, and all the walls were covered with this dark cherry paneling, which meant I couldn't bounce anything off the walls. But the ceiling was a nice white high ceiling, and I set the flash to about 3/4 and aimed it at about 45 degrees and bounced it. And this picture is hanging on the wall of their living room. So actually, I think I put this note here. It was half power. And so you can really smooth out the look on the face, and I'm using the ambient lighting. There's some ambient lighting coming from the side, and you really can't tell except for this very slight shadow. I had them a little bit too close to the wall that I used a flash at all. It's soft and flattering. It gives nice even lighting, and it's good for skin tones, and it eliminates red eye. Now, this frontal lighting pictured down at the bottom, there was lighting on the wall behind them, and I used a frontal flash. It was actually a separate strobe, but the point was it was a frontal flash to fill in some of these shadows. She kept turning away and talking to her sister. It was kind of a cute session. But the idea is that you can bounce light, see the diagram on the left, bounce light off the ceiling, off the walls, off of an umbrella, just about anything to fill in and give a nice smooth effect for the image that you're trying to create. I'm going to talk briefly about studio lighting. This is a day-long workshop that I teach actually, but I want to give you some idea of how frontal lighting is handled in the studio. And there's a number of elements, and they all point towards the subject, and that's this dark circle in the center is looking down, is the top of the head of the model. Put the camera in the center, slightly below eye level, and you have a light on either side of the camera. And you are lighting the backdrop also at about a stop to a stop and a half, sometimes even 2 stops above what's being sent downrange by the lights by the camera, so that that backdrop is completely white. It's a completely white background. And we put what's called a flag, which is a barrier between the light and the subject and the camera, so that this light doesn't spill over and give a sort of a rim lighting effect to the sides of the person, unless that's what you want. But more importantly, it keeps the light out of the lens of the camera. And that will keep your color and contrast intact. It will prevent lens flare and other artifacts. And so this is a good basic setup for studio lighting. It's called high key because everything is nice and bright. And the backdrop will be nice and white. You won't have to edit anything. Just use a sheet of white paper or a white wall. One last tip, make sure that you, looking at this diagram, that you don't somehow move the subject so close to the backdrop that these lights are hitting them the wrong way, or that you're casting a shadow unless that's what you really want. Now, white balance. White balance is almost a touchy subject. The camera companies put presets into the cameras, and so you can say, well, I'm shooting an incandescent light, so I can use the incandescent white balance preset. Or if I'm using flash, I can use the flash preset, etc., etc. But the fact is that these are approximations. It's very rare to have a photography situation where the lighting is precisely as was assumed when the presets were created. You can adjust these on camera. You can even choose a color temperature, which gets us into technical territory that's fairly complicated. But the presets will get you part of the way there, but they're not perfect. One of the better ways to get a really accurate white balance is do a custom white balance in the camera. And you can see in this diagram here, there's a white balance button. Okay, and different cameras do it slightly differently. You'll need the instruction manual, but the basic idea is to fill the frame with a good neutral reference, and one of the best ones around is the Spyder cube by Datacolor, and we have a picture of it here. We have a black area with a black trap, 2 white areas, 2 gray areas, and a chrome ball for specular highlights. When you fill the frame with this and you set your white balance, it's going to do a number of things, and at the risk of repeating myself later, I'll get into it now. When you set the white balance in the camera, it's going to improve the histogram that you see, and it's also going to improve the preview that you see. And here's the reason, is that the camera isn't showing you a histogram or a preview based on the raw file that you might be shooting. It's showing you the histogram or preview based on the JPEG. So the better the white balance in the camera, and the JPEGs, as we know, are a little bit fragile, a little bit touchy about being accurate. The better a job you can do with the in-camera white balance, the better the previews and the indicators are going to be on the back of the camera. You're going to be better off. Now, in post-production, if you include a Spyder cube in one of your early shots and your lighting doesn't change drastically during the photo shoot, You can use the gray area to set your gray point, your neutralize your color balance. You can use the white areas when you're in camera. Excuse me for talking over myself here. The white areas can be used if you have the blinkies turned on the LCD, and you can use the white areas to set your white point in your photo editing, and you can use the black area to set your black point, and you can use all of these to help you set your exposure. Now we have a whole webinar that's recorded on the Datacolor website on the use of the Spyder cube, and so I strongly encourage you, if you have interest, to go and watch that. Now ISO or sensitivity, in the past that referred to the film sensitivity to light. The ISO ranges in digital cameras from usually from 100 or 200 up to over 20,000. In the film days, it used to range starting at around 25, but we rarely see that now. In film with high ISO, you saw film grain. Now, that film grain in digital, it translates into noise. And unlike film, where you would see grain primarily in the darker areas, the shadows, in digital you see it in the highlights and the high midtones. So you have to watch that ISO rating. You're going to use it sometimes to get your shutter speed up, but in many cameras, if you crank the ISO too high, you're going to see a photograph that looks like this one on the right. So lower ISO tends to give better image quality. It also tends to give you, in an oblique kind of way, better dynamic range, a better range from highlights to shadows. The settings can be found on the exterior camera of the camera in some cases, or in the LCD controls, and this particular screenshot comes from a Nikon camera. I hate to say this, but just about every camera I've picked up does this slightly differently. So again, you're going to have to grab the manual. It'll take 5 minutes to figure out what you want to do. Just keep in mind that the lower the ISO, the lower the native sensitivity of the sensor. The higher the ISO, the more light you will be able to incorporate into your image, but the more risk that you take that you will have noise in the image. Now, some of the higher-end DSLRs are doing a great job of processing out noise in camera, but there's still some room for improvement. So if you can, shoot in good light, get that ISO down, and keep the noise out of the image. I'm going to take a sip of water. Pardon me a moment. Okay, so aperture and shutter controls. A lot of people, I shouldn't say most people, a lot of people are using the camera on full autopilot. And when you use the aperture and shutter controls in manual, you're going to find that you have more creative opportunities. And the aperture in images 1 and 2 here on the right, it's almost like a garden hose. The bigger the aperture, the more light it's admitting to the camera. The smaller the aperture, the less light it's admitting to the camera. Now, the way the camera settings refer to these aperture openings is actually an inverse. So the f-stop that you might see in the top lens might be f.2 or f.28. That low number indicates a larger aperture. And the one in the bottom might be at f16. That smaller number indicates a smaller aperture, and it's letting in less light. And there's some other issues that are connected with this that I'll get to in a moment. The shutter covers the film plane or digital sensor and moves to expose that area. So the shutter, that clicking noise that you hear, is in a DSLR, there's usually two. The first one is the mirror flipping up out of the way. And the second one is the shutter exposing the sensor of the film to take the image. Now the aperture also controls depth of field or depth of focus, and that really is the area of what's called acceptable sharpness. It begins at a predictable distance from the camera, say a couple of feet, and ends a predictable distance away. That could be a couple of feet more, or it could be out to infinity. The smaller the aperture is, the broader is the area of acceptable sharpness. The bigger the aperture is, the more shallow the area of acceptable sharpness. So if you set your camera to aperture priority, you can control the aperture, large or small, and control your depth of field. And the camera will meter and set the exposure, in other words, the shutter speed for you. And here's a great example of using the aperture opening to control depth of field. There's a couple walking down a pathway, and you can see that the faces and the clothing and such are quite sharp. But with this big aperture, the background falls away. Now, why do you want to do that? Well, the biggest reason is that a sharp background in this photograph is a distraction. You want the focus here, no pun intended, to be on the people. And so when you open that aperture up, first of all, you get some benefit in terms of faster shutter speed. And second of all, you're going to get that background to fall away into a nice, soft, painterly look, and it's not going to distract from your main subject. And so this gives you a certain amount of creative control that perhaps you can't get any other way. I'm going to zoom over here and forward. Now here's some examples for aperture and shutter control. You know, in bright daylight, you may want to use a small aperture anywhere from f8 to f16. A fast shutter, say f120 to 1/200. At twilight, you're going to want a larger aperture, maybe f2.8, a mid or slower shutter speed at around 1/60th, and you may want to supplement this with flash or a higher ISO to get that shutter speed up. Generally speaking, most people can't hold the camera steady below a 60th. If you're at a 60th or lower, you may want to start thinking about a camera support or leaning against a wall or that sort of thing. In indoors with normal lighting, you can use a larger or mid aperture, a mid to upper shutter speed. You can increase the ISO and shoot, or you can use flash and a mid-range ISO. So an example would be half power flash and ISO 400 or ISO 800. You can also turn the room lights up. I did that the other day and supplemented that with the flash, and it worked quite well. A little tip for you: photos that look wobbly or blurry are frequently not the result of a slow of missed focus. They're a result of a slow shutter speed. So if you're looking at the back of your camera and you see movement in the image, particularly from side to side or up and down, then you really want to make sure that you've got that shutter speed up there and that you know, you're freezing the action. That's the phrase I was looking for. Now, in terms of evaluating exposure, the LCD on most digital cameras can help you evaluate exposure, but they have limitations. We talked about that a little bit before. It's working off the JPEG and generating both the histogram and what's called the blinkies. The blinkies are the areas that show you are the areas on the LCD when they're flashing on and off that show you overexposure. You know, Patty, I want to stop for a second and say that I'm hearing a lot of static on my end, and I hope that nobody else is. I just want to point that out. So if you use the Spyder cube, as we discussed before, the Spyder cube can be used to set the white balance in the camera. They can also be used to help you evaluate the blinkies. If you set the white balance in the camera, obviously your histogram and the blinkies are going to be more accurate. Another little tip is if you look down here at the histogram, you've got these were arrows. They're pointing to the ends of the histogram. On the left is the darker end of the histogram. You really don't want to see it spike like the one you see on the right. It's not quite touching the edge, so it's barely legal. What you don't want to see is an exposure where this thing climbs all the way up the side of the histogram. That generally means that you're losing detail in the highlights. And the same thing happens on the left. If it's pushing over to the left, you're probably underexposed and you're losing detail in the shadows. That old phrase, the mountain in the middle, is a good rule of thumb. I think that you'll find that as long as you stay with that mountain in the middle, you'll be pretty safe with your exposures, that you're not going to have people with skin that has no texture, or light colored clothing that has no texture, or even areas that are completely blown out. So do think about the Spyder Cube and its role in helping you control the camera. And of course, in post-production, the Spyder Cube is quite useful. Camera supports. Let's talk a little bit about that. A lot of people don't realize that when you're using a smaller camera, let's say it doesn't have a viewfinder, it just has an LCD, you have to hold the camera out at least some distance from yourself. This goes for cell phone cameras too. And what does that mean? It means that the camera is moving around. So if you're in low light and you're using one of these cameras, you're probably going to get camera shake. Now, some cell phones have flash on them. Flash is your friend in those circumstances. But small cameras still need support. Lean against a door jamb or wall. And what I would normally do is, let's say I'm holding the camera with two hands. I would take my left hand and lean it against the left door jamb, or my right hand and lean it against the right door jamb. I might use a little tripod or a regular tripod. Even a monopod, which is less expensive, can give you 1 or 2 stops extra in terms of getting a steady shot in your exposure. But do think about camera support. A lot of people don't, and then they're disappointed with their photographs afterwards. So really anything we do, the top of a fence, a beanbag, you name it, but camera support is your friend. Talked a little bit about phone cameras. There are clip-on lenses for phone cameras, which are really cool. Do check out whether or not that clip-on lens obscures the little flash that's incorporated into the phone. The flash is limited, and in many cases, low-light photos would be noisy. So I look at phone cameras, unlike a lot of people, as a tool for opportunistic photos. But if you're really going to get serious, my suggestion is to please do at least bring a point and shoot or a pocket camera with you. Now I see a question on here, what's the purpose of the exposure blinkies again? The exposure blinkies show you whether or not you are overexposing the photograph. So the areas that are blinking on the back of the camera are areas that are overexposed and are very likely to be losing detail and texture and all those good things. That means you want to try and reduce your exposure. Now let's talk about posing and backgrounds. I ran into some people from a company that I'm beginning to like quite a bit. Layer Cake software, and some of the stuff that they make is called Love Bugs, and you can see that they have these backgrounds that you can use. Well, the backgrounds are very useful. You can, for example, buy a background and shoot against that, or you can shoot against a green screen and then paste in basically your subjects against a really nice, engaging background. And these are very cute, they're very useful, and you know, most of us, I think, for events like this, we want lifetime images rather than snapshots. Environmental portraits are great. Kids in their own environment or families in their own environment are great too. I'm not knocking that at all. You want to ask yourself, in terms of your posing, where's the light coming from? Is it helping you or not? And should you change it? And how's the light on the background? Remember I said before, do get folks away from the background, at least enough so that you don't see shadows cast on it. Positioning and posing, we talked a little bit about that right at the beginning. My tendency is to perhaps take a few what you might call formally posed photographs at the beginning and then ease into candids and getting out from behind the camera, using props, posing people different ways. Don't be afraid to take 3 or 4 shots and pose people different ways. And although folks will complain sometimes when you're doing that. Just ask for their patience and they'll give it to you. Watch the angles, use unconventional camera positions. This picture of these two kids was obviously taken at their eye level, not the photographer's. So if you're standing with the camera at eye level all the time, you need to start thinking about getting down on the floor with the kids or even sitting in a chair. Sometimes that can help. Down on one knee, but whatever you're doing, get that camera angle away from eye level, off to the side, down lower, or up higher. And don't be afraid to coach and direct. You know, you're talking to people. Sometimes when I have siblings like this, they're constantly squabbling and talking to each other, and et cetera, and maybe not getting along that great. And I'll say, pretend you like each other. And they'll do it. And you might even get a decent smile because they think that's pretty funny. And you know, don't be afraid to be directive. People don't really know what to do with themselves in front of the camera most of the time. Let's talk about editing. There's editing available on computer and online. I'm going to talk about on-computer editing. The software can be simple and complex. In many cases, the software comes with the camera. And for basic purposes, there's nothing wrong, for example, with the software that comes, the basic software that comes with a Nikon or a Canon or a Fuji or a Sony camera. However, they lack certain tools that you may find useful. So for example, a sort and select tool where you can, if you've got 100 photographs, maybe only 10 are real lifetime keepers. How do you identify those? Well, for example, in Lightroom, you can actually give them a rating between 1 and 5, and then you can group the 5s all in one place and work on them. You can color correct or adjust saturation. You can adjust exposure and brightness. If you're shooting raw, that's really a big advantage because now you've got quite a bit more latitude as far as whether or not you got that picture perfectly recorded the first time. If you have an exposure slider and you're working with the raw file, you've got a little bit more latitude in terms of bringing it up or bringing it down. You can work on sharpness, and you can actually make a slightly soft picture sharper. It won't save a ruined photograph, don't get me wrong, but it will help improve the appearance of many photographs. You can crop, and of course there are sharing utilities and printing utilities built into many of these. Now let's talk about displays for a minute, because this is one of the things that's a real issue as far as creative control goes for a lot of people. A lot of people go out and buy a display and bring it home and assume that it's going to show them the right colors. And there's this trick that the eye and brain play on us, that the eye and brain will adjust to just about any situation, even if it's a bad one. And so even when the screen is a little pink and a little bit, or a little blue and way too bright, the eye and brain will adjust to that. And then you'll start editing your photos and go to make prints, and if the screen's too bright, your prints are going to be too dark. What you really want to do, and you can't do this by eye, is calibrate your display. Get a display calibrator. If you're into your photography and you really want to have that creative control and get good results, get a display calibrator. And what it does is, the software and the device together will adjust your screen to a standardized set of color and brightness and shadows. And so if you see these patches here, I didn't say that last part particularly well, but I hope you get the idea. If you look at these patches here, which I've adjusted to the point where they're ridiculously off to make this point, you see these patches here, this might be what you would see on a display out of the box. And what the Spyder hardware and software will do will be to adjust all of these colors, record the results, and make them part of the way the display performs. And it's saved on your computer so that every time you start your computer, these adjustments are applied to the output that's given to you by the display. It's very, very useful too. It's well worth the investment. Now, software applications that might be available to you, iPhoto is a good example. iPhoto's come a long way from the beginning. It used to be that you could adjust one or two things in iPhoto, and it was very, very heavy-handed. And it still has its limitations, but those limitations, it's been greatly improved, and those limitations in many cases have gone away. And you can see here that you can not just rotate and fix red eye, but these are the automated tools. You can enhance the photo, you can straighten, crop, retouch it, all those things. And they've also added a lot of the controls that you might see in Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw. You have an exposure slider, which is really useful. Contrast, saturation. You can improve definition, might be called clarity in other applications. Recover some highlights and shadows. In other words, if the image is overexposed, you might be able to recover some of the highlights. For example, this flower is a little bit overexposed. Shadow detail, sharpness, denoise, and of course you can adjust the color temperature, which is how warm or how cool the image looks. Lightroom 4 I wouldn't go so far as to say it's iPhoto on steroids. It's a whole different animal. It's got just about every control and adjustment that's possible to have for your photographs. Lightroom 4 in particular is head and shoulders above previous versions of Lightroom. It's not expensive, particularly if you're doing an upgrade. And you can see here on the screen that there's a multitude of adjustments. You have a histogram, a live histogram. You have ways to organize your photos. You can see each one of these has little stars under it so they can be organized. Some have a 3, some have a 4, some have a 5. You can create books and slideshows and print and even publish to the web. I'm going to back up a little bit. One of the things that I particularly like about Lightroom, there's two things actually. I talked a little bit about this rating, and you can see that these are not in any particular order. But if you go up to, I believe it's either the edit or the view menu, and you go to sort, you can tell it to sort by rating, and all of the 5s will slide over to the right. So if you have 100 photographs and only 10 that are really your favorites, now you're going to have them all in one bucket. You're going to be able to work on those without wasting time on the images that just don't rate. Now, I want to point something out. One of the things that I particularly like about Adobe is Adobe TV. And Adobe TV is on the web, and they have an incredible array of instructional videos on how to edit photographs using Lightroom 4. And I suggest that if you're new to this or you're considering getting it, that you go and take a look at Adobe TV. The instructors are particularly good. They've divided the subject matter up in a way that makes it easy for you to go step by step and learn how to edit your photos. And I think you'll find that get it right in the camera is the first half, and the second half is effective photo editing. So that's something to consider. And before I move on, I also want to mention that we've been doing 1 to 2 of these webinars every month for at least a year, and they're all recorded. And you can go to the Spyder or the Datacolor websites, and you can access those pre-recorded webinars, and you can get a lot out of them. We have webinars on color management, for example. We have a whole range of subjects and it's all free. So I suggest you take a look at that. Now, in terms of sharing your images, before you start sharing your images, please back them up. If anything can go wrong, it will go wrong. And when I say back them up, I mean take the card out of the camera, put it in a card reader, and copy it to a drive on your computer before you do anything else. Don't, for example, start, and I've seen people do this, actually plug the camera into the computer and start trying to edit. That's a recipe for a bad result. You need to get them off the camera onto the computer, and if you have the resources, once they're copied onto one hard drive, copy them onto a second hard drive. And the third tip is put the card, eject it from the computer and put the card back in the camera, and don't format that card until you're ready to use it again, because God forbid this happens, but every once in a while the computer goes south and at least you have the pictures on the card. So I never format camera cards until I'm ready to start shooting something somewhere else, different subject, and I know that those pictures are safe. You can share through social media, email, a website, holiday cards. There's a lot of templates out there, and in fact some of the print service providers are offering specials right now on Valentine's cards. You may want to go and take a look at that. You can print them yourself or you can outsource them. There's kiosks in a lot of major stores. I'm not going to name names because some are better than others. And in fact, on that subject, what I would do if I were you, if you're going to go to a kiosk or you're going to go to a local business, or even if you're going to mail them off or send them over the internet to be printed and sent back to you, send them a couple of test images first, including an image that you know what it's supposed to look like. You know what that image is going to, you know what you want it to look like, and so when it comes back to you, it's kind of a test, along with a couple of new ones, and see how they do before you send them 100 or 50 or even 20 images and maybe waste some time and money and be disappointed. Send them a few tests, see how they do with it, and then send them the rest. And the same thing goes for these kiosks. Print a couple and stand there and look at it and see how's it doing. Maybe the machine next to it's in better shape. That happens. Along the same lines, a lot of these big stores, it depends on who's running the machine and what day of the week it is and whether or not they clean the machine properly. And so ask them to make a test. Go do something else for a half an hour or 40 minutes, come back, see how they did, and then give them the rest of your work before you give them the whole enchilada. I think you'll be happier. Well, we've just about reached the end of our time. We're a few minutes early. I'd like to thank Datacolor very much for sponsoring this. I hope everyone has a great Valentine's Day. The winners of the Spyder Cube are Ian Hudson and Sharon, forgive me if I don't pronounce this right, Sager. What will happen is that Patty, our marketing manager, will get in touch with you and make arrangements to get the product to you. Again, I'm David Saffir. My blog, which also has some nice instructional material on it, is davidsaffir.wordpress.com. I do take emails from my students. If you send me an email, I'll do the best I can to answer your question. If I don't answer you in the first 24 hours, it usually means I got buried with emails and I missed it. Do send it again. Don't be shy. David Tobie also has a great blog with a lot of good technical information and shooting advice, cdtobie.wordpress.com. We're going to have a whole series of webinars this year ranging from basic to very advanced. I encourage you to sign up on the mailing list if you're not already, and join us for the ones that interest you. Thanks very much, and have a great day and a great holiday.